Given that it wasn't that long ago, you'd think it'd be easy to remember everyone from the PG era of WWE. After all, many of the performers from this time are still going strong today. But while it might not take much effort to recall the likes of CM Punk, Sheamus, or The New Day, when it comes to the people we're about to discuss today, that's a different story altogether. But just who were the most forgotten superstars of the PG era? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with Camacho. Of course, if you've been watching SmackDown over the last few months, you'll know there's a reason we've chosen to start with Camacho today, and that's because he's never been more relevant. Not since he rejoined the WWE in the summer of 2024 and became a member of Solo Sikoa's version of the Bloodline. But while today he might be going by the name of Tanga Loa, 7-time former IWGP Tag Team Champion and one half of the Gorillas of Destiny alongside his brother Tama Tonga, back in the early 2010s, he was known under an entirely different moniker. Yes, this was the point the son of Haku was cast as a Latino rather than a Samoan, one who went by the name of Camacho and who served as the tag team partner for Unico. And while it might seem strange at first to think that Tanga Loa was playing a different nationality to his own here, it's not like this is the first time such a thing has happened with a Samoan superstar, as it also previously happened with Yokozuna. But unlike Yokozuna, Camacho did not meet with a lot of success in WWE. Rather, he hit a ceiling very quickly, a ceiling which went no higher than primarily being a job guy who appeared on both Superstars and NXT back during its early Full Sail University days. Sure, he did make the odd appearance on a pay-per-view undercard here and there, but this was not enough to make him stick in people's minds much. Hell, so forgettable would this run be, when Tanga Loa returned to WWE in 2024, many fans were unaware he'd been there before at all, with it becoming something of a trivia note that he once played Camacho. Will he have a better go of things this time around? We hope so, as he's certainly in a much higher profile role now, so for that reason alone, his time with the Bloodline is sure to be remembered fondly. So he should really count himself lucky then, because not every member of the Samoan dynasty in WWE gets a second bite at the apple like he's done, something which is evident in our next subject, Manu. Now, when you think of great members of the Anoa'i family who have appeared in WWE over the years, you probably think of a few particular names first. Names like Roman Reigns, The Rock, The Usos, Yokozuna, and Rikishi. One person you probably don't think of, though, is Manu, the often forgotten son of Afa. Why is that? Well, unlike those other people we mentioned, Manu's time in WWE was so forgettable, barely anyone remembers it today. But it didn't have to be this way, as when he first debuted there in the mid-2000s, there were moves being made behind the scenes to push him all the way to the top. Hell, Vince McMahon went as far as to give him a spot in an early version of The Legacy, Randy Orton's stable of second and third generation stars, which also gave us the initial rise of Cody Rhodes. But while Cody may have soared in this role, Manu ultimately floundered. So badly did he flounder, in fact, by the time The Legacy really got established, he'd already be gone from it. And what's more, soon after that, he'd be gone from WWE for good. What went wrong here then? Well, it appears that at this point in his career, the Connecticut native just didn't have it. And with there being no bloodline in late 2000s WWE to give him a spot in, there was little else he could do in WWE following his failed run with The Legacy. So because of that, he'd move over to the indie circuit instead, the place he remains today, working with other family members such as LA Smooth. Could he return to WWE one day? We suppose it's possible, as he may one day join the bloodline himself too. But let's move away from the Bloodline for now and on to someone else who never managed to click with WWE audiences during his time there in the PG era. Who are we talking about here? Why, Vance Archer, of course. Now, if you're a current-day wrestling fan, then you're probably more familiar with Vance Archer under his alternative name of Lance Archer, two-time IWGP United States Champion, three-time IWGP Tag Team Champion, and current member of the AEW roster. And why wouldn't you be? Because he's had a lot more success under this title than he ever did under his previous one. Sure, you'd think that a man of his size and with his athletic ability would be a shoo-in for success under Vince McMahon, but unfortunately for the Texan, this is not what happened when he joined the roster there in 2009. What went wrong? Well, to be honest, we're not really sure. After all, as we said, Archer appeared to have everything required to get over in WWE. The only thing we can think of is that mostly being slotted away on the WWE CW brand did such a number on his visibility, most people forgot he was there as soon as he left the screen. Yes, the Murder Hawk Monster is one of those performers whose time with WWE came when they were trying to make ECW's revived brand. And this meant less fans were aware of him at the time, but when WWE CW ended and he was moved over to SmackDown, it wasn't like things went any better there. as there he'd be another big man amongst a sea of big men. So perhaps it shouldn't be surprising that his act never clicked with fans, and because of that, it would be very easy for them to forget him once he was released from his contract in November of 2010. But as we mentioned earlier, at least Lance Archer was able to recover after the fact by rebuilding himself in New Japan Pro Wrestling as the enforcer of Suzuki-gun. And since then, he's found himself on TV again as a member of the AEW roster. It's a shame the same couldn't be said for our next subject, a former opponent of Archer's in WWE, and former tag team partner of fellow AEW alumni Trent Beretta, the one, the only, Kalen Croft. Yes, Kalen Croft was never exactly what you'd call a star attraction during his wrestling career. The closest he got, in fact, was during his aforementioned time in WWE as part of the Dude Busters alongside Trent Beretta, a team who did a job or two for Vance Archer when they were active. Of course, if the Ohio native had his way, we're sure things would have been different, as he could have had a much higher ceiling. For whatever reason though, back during the PG era WWE, there was never a point where it felt like Croft was going to break through that glass ceiling. And because he was so low down the pecking order, his run there has pretty much disappeared from memory since. Sure, it didn't help that, like with Lance Archer, much of his time there was spent in the WWE CW brand, but it wasn't like the Dude Busters never appeared on a larger stage, as in 2010 they did begin making occasional appearances on SmackDown. Sadly though, these appearances did little to raise the pair's stock, as they'd be reduced to little more than job guys there, guys who could eat a loss whenever placed against someone like Crime Time or the Hart Dynasty. And after a few months of this, the cord would finally be pulled on the duo altogether. But while his teammate Trent Beretta would keep going with WWE for a few years yet after this, and would eventually find greater success on both the indie circuit and in AEW, Kalen Croft would never get the opportunity to reach such heights, as this would mark the point he was released from his WWE contract. Would he ever do anything after his time in WWE came to an end? No, he'd actually retire from in-ring competition almost immediately thereafter, meaning there were no further opportunities for him to turn things around and create something fans could remember him by. And that's really a shame then, as it's not like he was someone with no talent. But alas, this is sometimes the way things work out. But what about our next subject, that being Ricky Ortiz? Yes, prior to ever working for Vince McMahon's company, Ortiz was in the midst of a football career. A career which saw him play for the likes of the Indiana Firebirds and the Colorado Crush in the AFL. So when WWE were scouting for fresh young athletes to bring into their system in 2006 then, it made all the sense in the world that they'd want to hire him to a developmental contract. Unfortunately though, any hopes the WWE might have had of turning Ortiz into a star wouldn't pan out in the end. Now, after spending a couple of years down in Ohio Valley Wrestling, the Phoenix native would make his main roster debut in July of 2008 and proceed to do absolutely nothing. But to be fair to him, it wasn't exactly his fault. No, it was another case of someone being locked away on the WWE CW roster. A roster where, while some performers did thrive and managed to kickstart their career, most people struggled to get over it. Would things improve for the Arizona native once he was called up to SmackDown in April of 2009? Not quite. In fact, this period only solidified Ortiz's spot as being a forgotten star of the PG era, as there's nothing of note to be talked about here, other than the fact his last match saw him be squashed by the Great Khali. But at least Ricky Ortiz's time in WWE wasn't a complete wash, as it was while working there that he met Layla, one-time Divas champion and one-time Women's champion, and their relationship would continue even after the former football player left WWE behind in 2009, with them ultimately getting married in 2015. So there were some positives that happened during his run. It's just a shame not much of this is remembered by fans today though. But let's move away from the men for a moment and on to the women, as there are plenty of ladies who had forgotten runs during the PG era too. And one of the most notable examples of this can be found in our next subject, Tiffany. Yes, before there was Tiffany Stratton, there was another performer who held that name in WWE. Unfortunately for Taran Terrell though, the woman behind the gimmick, this one wouldn't find anywhere near as much success. And the reason for that was largely down to the time period she came around during. After all, if Tiffany had arrived a few years later when women's wrestling in WWE was managing to gain some traction, things might have been different, but instead, she appeared on our screens during the PG era. the Era of the Divas, and this meant that after debuting on the main roster in 2008 as part of the WWE CW brand, she'd be treated like yet another performer who would only take part in 3-minute matches whenever called upon. Needless to say then, this didn't allow the New Orleans native to make much of an impact with fans. Hell, even after making appearances on Raw and SmackDown in 2009 and 2010, the latter of which saw her form a tag team with Kelly Kelly named the Blonderage, live audiences still wouldn't take to her. So because of this, when it came time to make roster cuts later that year, she'd find herself on the chopping block. But at least things had a happy ending for Taran Terrell, because after her time in WWE ended, she was able to get a new lease on life over in TNA, where women were treated more seriously. In fact, during her run there, she'd even become a one-time Knockouts champion, a far cry from her previous run. Sure, her time in WWE still might be forgotten by most, but at least there was a silver lining to her career. And the same thing could be said in some ways about our next subject too, another PG era superstar who got a second chance in TNA after the fact. Who are we talking about this time? Who else but Ryan Braddock? Now, if you have no idea who Ryan Braddock is, then we wouldn't blame you, as this one is really digging into the depths of obscurity from the mid to late 2000s. But we assure you that Jay Bradley, the man behind the gimmick, did indeed wrestle for WWE between 2005 and 2009, with the latter part of this run seeing him be involved in the PG era. What did he do well there? Well, not a lot, and that's the precise reason he's gone so forgotten. In fact, so little did WWE do with Braddock that even on his main roster debut in 2008, a moment which was supposed to first introduce fans to the new talent, he was absolutely jobbed out by the Big Show in short order. Yes, before audiences could even get a chance to figure out who this new wrestler was, he was already being treated like a jobber. And that decision is a particularly baffling one, as in the years prior to this, the company had seen fit to make him Ohio Valley Wrestling World Champion on 2 separate occasions while he was working down in the developmental show. Obviously then, something must have made Vince McMahon change his opinion about the Illinois native during the intervening time, and because of this, when his brief SmackDown run happened, it wouldn't go well. Still, there was always WWE CW, right? Yes, less than 1 month into his main roster run, and Ryan Braddock would be relegated to the C Show, where, rather than be built back up as someone who could later return to the Blue brand a bigger star, he would end up doing more jobs, this time to the likes of Ricky Ortiz. So we can all probably guess what happened next then. With the company unhappy with his progress, Braddock would be sent down to the developmental territory of FCW, where he'd run out the rest of his contract. But like with Tiffany, this wasn't the end of his career, thankfully. No, following his time in WWE, the man once more going as Jay Bradley would get a second wind in places like TNA, NWA, and Pro Wrestling Noah. No, he never became a star in any of these companies either, but at least his time in them worked out better than his forgotten WWE run. It's just a shame there wasn't such a second life available for our next subject after she flopped in WWE, Rebecca D Petro. Yes, we're getting into some really obscure people again. So for those who have no memory of Rebecca D Petro, here's the primer. Back in 2006, after a successful run as a model, the Massachusetts native decided to try out her hand at getting involved in the wrestling industry when she applied to be a part of that year's Diva Search. Unfortunately for her though, while she would ultimately make it into this tournament, she wouldn't come close to winning. That said, this didn't stop WWE from signing her up to a contract anyway, and so like that, a new WWE superstar was born. So it was then that following a brief run in Deep South Wrestling, she'd make her debut on WWE CW in October of 2006, there acting primarily as a backstage interviewer. That's right, it looked like D Petro was never going to go on to become an in-ring performer, and instead remain behind the microphone. The closest she ever came, in fact, was when she acted as one of many lumberjills standing around the ring during a women's title match at November 2006's Cyber Sunday. And soon after that was done, her time in WWE would be over too. Yes, it was in March of 2007 that, after realizing her career in wrestling wasn't going to work out, Rebecca requested, and subsequently was granted, her release. And so because her time was so brief and so uneventful then, it really shouldn't surprise anyone to learn she's amongst the most forgotten parts of the PG era. That said, for as forgotten as Rebecca D Petro is, she may still be more remembered than our next subject, Eric Escobar. Who was Eric Escobar? Well, he was someone who, after learning the ropes in his home country of Puerto Rico, got a chance to sign on the dotted line with WWE in 2005. Sadly for him, though, this would then be followed by a full 4 years in developmental across both Deep South Wrestling and Florida Championship Wrestling, something which probably should have served as a warning sign of what was to come. Yes, with Vince McMahon clearly taking a while to see anything in the rookie, it spelled bad news for his eventual run on SmackDown, a run which would begin in 2009. And any fears Escobar might have had about his future were confirmed here when, upon debuting on the Blue brand, he'd find himself losing his first bout against Primo. A bad start if we ever saw one. Could things still have picked up at this point? Sure. But when the Puerto Rican's next role was to go after and ultimately lose to Matt Hardy, it didn't exactly cast him in a winning light with fans. So pretty quickly they decided not to pay attention to anything he was doing then, and this uncaring attitude towards him would persist for the next few months, with even a babyface turn from Escobar in the winter of 2009 doing little to change his fortunes. Yes, the whole thing was a wash by now, and so that's probably why WWE decided to pull the plug when in January of 2010, they'd release the struggling star from his contract, leaving him no opportunity to ever get fans on his side again in the future. No, instead of this, he'd return home to Puerto Rico, and there run out the clock on what remained of his in-ring career. But what about our next subject, Courtney Taylor? Yes, Courtney had a similar run to Rebecca D Petro in the sense that she never competed in the ring on WWE TV. No, while the former fitness model spent some time wrestling in FCW, by the time she was called up to the WWE CW brand, she would also be booked to work as a backstage interviewer. And after a short and uneventful run here, her only appearance on the main roster saw her appear in an odd segment which saw her chase a man dressed as a tiger around the arena. After this happened though, we never saw her again on Raw, with this seemingly acting as her farewell to the wrestling business, as she was released from her contract soon after. But what about our next subject, that being Lucky Cannon? Who was Lucky Cannon? Well, he was a contestant of the 2nd and 5th seasons of NXT during its original game show incarnation. And while his time spent in FCW prior to this was a huge success, with him even becoming a one-time FCW World Heavyweight Champion, he would never quite have the same success while in NXT, as he wouldn't win either of the seasons he competed in, nor would he ever be called up to the main roster. Yes, it certainly is a shame that Lucky never got a chance to develop more, because he ultimately got released from the company in 2011, as he certainly had a lot of potential to become a star. After all, he had the look, with him being 6'5", and he also wasn't bad in the ring either. Unfortunately for him though, it was never meant to be, and he's since gone on to become an example of yet another forgotten member of WWE's PG era. Could he have done more with his time spent in WWE? Most certainly, if all the stars had aligned at the right time, but then again, the same could be said about everyone else we've discussed today too, as they all prove that sometimes it can be hard to make it in the big league and make a splash that is memorable.